And I think that you don't need to be anti alternative energy or green energy to be excited about it. One could suggest that any reliable baseload power that doesn't generate carbon, aka nuclear, is green energy and a good
Hmm.
thing. And I think that we've begun to see a realization of that amongst people who were opposed to nuclear energy in the past. Had you and I had a discussion 5 years ago about the efficacy of nuclear power in the United States, we would have generated a lot of hate, even amongst your listeners. Uh, the administration has gone from hating us to subsidizing us in the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, I will admit I felt cleaner when I was hated, but being an old man, wanting change in my lifetime, being subsidized is in fact better than being hated. But it's
Right.
important to look too at a society that's made a decision around alternative energies, particularly in your home state, California.
Hmm.
Wind and solar, which is to say intermittent power, only works if you have the ability to generate power when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. And that peaking power is primarily natural gas oriented. So, to the extent that you're going to take the grid above 30% or 35% reliance on intermittent energy, the only way that you can do it in a way that guarantees energy when and where it's needed is by building substantial natural gas peaking generation and substantial natural gas storage and transmission. They go hand in hand. If you don't have the ability to offset the intermediate nature of transitional alternative energy, you don't have transitional alternative energy. That's a simple fact. Look at solar as an example. It's really challenged at night when the sun doesn't shine. You have to have the ability, if you're going to use solar power when it's available, to, to substitute some other form of intermittent power when solar is unavailable, and that is primarily natural gas. They go hand in hand. The United States and Canada are blessed because we have ample supplies of sun, we have ample supplies of wind, we have ample supplies of uranium, we have ample supplies of oil, we have ample supplies of gas. Relative to our economic activity, we are truly blessed. And to the extent that we build on our blessings, we will continue to outpace the rest of the world in terms of our material well-being, which I suspect almost everybody, almost I say, perhaps not the effete academic classes, but I think everybody else would like to see both themselves and their neighbors better off materially. Well, I think the first thing is that some of the obvious sins around the oil and gas business uh, need to be economically controlled. Every well that's drilled in the United States shouldn't be drilled until there's an environmental compliance bond in place, so that an environmental failing isn't paid for by the state, isn't paid for by the taxpayer. There are something like 400,000 uncapped abandoned wells in the United States, leaking, as an example, salt water and oil and gas from deeper horizons into freshwater horizons. That exists today. There is no requirement, even in the People's Republic of California, that before drilling a new well, you have to have an environmental bonding and an environmental and remediation bond in place, so that to the extent that there's a blowout, so that to the extent that the well ultimately needs to be cemented, plugged, and abandoned, that capital is put up in front, so that the bankruptcy of the operator, as an example, doesn't result in the transfer of liability to the state. Because when the transfer of liability goes to the state, uh, action doesn't occur. There are wells in California and wells in Texas that have been, uh, in effect, state obligations because of the bankruptcy of the operator for 20 or 25 years with no remedial action taking place. Remember, as an example, that the Federal Environmental Trust Fund is just that. It's a promise, it's an
Hmm.
entitlement. In other words, we have mandated the expenditure, but there's no money to spend, nor no political will. pardon me, to divert money to plugging and abandonment in favor of more expedient domestic spending programs. So the first thing that has to happen is that the industry itself has to fund remediation, and they have to fund it up front. That doesn't take place today. Californians, however, have to remember the old maxim that used to be on bumper stickers in California, quote, no drilling, no driving. I would suspect that the Los Angeles and Ventura basins alone have 500 or 600 million barrels of recoverable oil that Governor Gruesome will not allow to be developed. The Stevens Formation in the San Joaquin Basin is estimated to have 500 million barrels of what is currently unrecoverable oil. Even by California standards, it's a little self-serving to suggest that the environmental degradation should occur in West Texas, while the benefits of cheap oil, and you'll remember that Governor Gruesome crucified the oil industry when the price went up, on the one hand saying you can't drill, and on the other hand saying the price of gasoline can't go up.
Right.
It's important that people accommodate both parts of that discussion. As I was just in the People's Republic of California last week.
Right. Well, and you were from here originally. Right?
I'm from there originally. The population base that I came into contact with over the last week, I wouldn't suggest would be particularly supportive of a less restrictive environment. There was, not that I'm a Trump supporter, by the way. I couldn't bring myself to vote for either Harris or Trump. And they didn't have none of the above as a choice on the ballot. But there was widespread gloom over the election of Trump, widespread criticism when they criticized the president-elect, and I agreed with most of their criticisms. When I asked him why they couldn't nominate somebody who could beat somebody like that, they seemed to be at a loss. And so I suspect that at least in the part of California that I dealt in, there was a sort of a disconnect between some aspects of what they would like to see in society and how that might occur. But it's dangerous to try to extrapolate, your own anecdotal experience with reality. And I think Governor Gruesome, for all its faults, has very good political antenna. The recent statements from the governor about the state of policing in Oakland, which is a manifestation of his own political beliefs, where he became critical of defunding of the Oakland Police Department and the constraints that the Oakland Police Department operates under, reflects his perception of a changing sentiment, because certainly the political base that he comes from, the sort of Bay Area progressive mafia, isn't consistent with changing his views around nuclear power or his changing around policing. However, I think he's a superb campaigner. I think he has superb political instincts. Like most politicians, I suspect he's lying when his lips are moving. But if you
he can detect a change in the political winds faster than any other
absolutely,
human.
Absolutely. I mean, I think he's in line to be rewarded for wrecking California by being nominated to run for president. Truly a strange world, but he's a superb politician. That's important. And I think going back to energy, that people who are looking at U.S. production need to understand that there are several important constraints. One of them is political, which can be dealt with. Another is geology. The suggestion at $70 oil that we've drilled 75 or 80% of our tier 1 locations is probably true. Our ability to continue to grow our production after 2 or 3 years is probably becoming constrained depending on price. But if you take the price from $70 to $85, a bunch of tier 2 locations become tier 1 locations.
Yep.
Or if you lower the cost of capital, so that the prime interest rate falls by 200 basis points because this is a capital intensive business, then tier 2 locations become tier 1 locations. Or if you change technology to allow for better extraction, of tight reserves or lower cost of penetration and drilling. In other words, if you lower the cost of exploiting resources, again, tier two locations become tier one locations. If technology doesn't change, if the cost of capital doesn't change, and if the price doesn't change, I think that we are approaching a plateau, a producing plateau in most of the major basins in the US, with the probable exception of the Marcellus in the US Northeast. You pointed out a couple things. The long end of the yield curve is defying the Fed, which means that savers have a different expectation of inflation than the political class does.
Mhm.
The second thing that's happening is that the delta between the energy industry's cost of capital and the rest of the economy's cost of capital is changing. Out of favor, oil and gas is still an out of favor industry. So insurance rates are going up, interest rates, particularly for non-investment grade issuers, but also prime rate issuers, is going up and availability is declining. And the equity cost of capital is going up. The discrepancy between the enterprise value of energy producers and the net present value of their cash flows at current commodity prices is at historic lows. So their equity cost of capital is the highest it's been in 50 years relative to the oil price. At the same time, that debt is both less available and more expensive. And that will be a challenge to the industry. For me personally, as an investor, a lender to the energy business, a supplier of insurance to the energy business, and an equity investor in the energy business, the fact that their cost of capital is at an all-time relative high is attractive to me. But I can understand from a societal point of view how energy consumers wouldn't like that. Globally, the International Energy Agency suggests that the oil and gas business worldwide, including parastatal firms, is deferring about $1 billion a day in sustaining capital investments. You can do that for a little while, but this is a capital intensive business. No capital, no business. You can see the long-term impact of that policy in places like Venezuela and Mexico, where the national oil companies have been piggy banks for politically expedient domestic spending programs, and where their ability to produce is as much as 75% reduced over 20 years,
Jeez.
despite very large latent reserves.